ahead.
Hello and welcome tonight. Hello and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. I'm your host, Will Lacoma, and our audio-video coordinator of the evening is Tobias Berblinger. Together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you. Our series highlights an eclectic group of speakers, experiences, and workshops across a broad range of subjects, dictated by our curatorial interests in areas of culture, design, science, technology, art, fabrication, and design techniques, and lost common knowledge. As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you are now all members, provided you adhere to our philosophy. Ex curiositas scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice. This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, and the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Philip Fell. During over 20 years as a government lobbyist, Philip Fell became fascinated with the exercise of government power over its citizens. As a historian by education, he observed this use of power and frequently contemplated whether its exercise in 20th century America paralleled its exercise throughout history. Now, an adjunct instructor at the Art Institute of Portland, his somewhat irreverent meditations have tilted towards artists and their relationship with governing powers. Although he hasn't yet formulated a grand unified theory, he has discovered some truths. Preeminent among them is Mark Twain's observation that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes.
Good evening. I've been considering this evening for the last few weeks. I think spending a bi-weekly evening considering new and interesting knowledge is a fine way to spend your time. And your Curiosity Club seems to be in the tradition of a number of other clubs that have coalesced around ideas in theology, art, science, general knowledge. The common thread in all those has been curiosity. Back in the late 1900s, or as you think of them, the olden days, when the organization I worked for interviewed potential new employees, I always looked for competent and curious people. I think curiosity is a trait that can carry your career and your life to unexpected meaning. So I'm pleased to have been invited to speak, but also a bit intimidated, because asking me to speak suggests that I have something significant to say. And defining what that is has been very difficult. Tobias and I have met a couple of times to discuss a topic. Both times, as we left the bar, I knew what I intended to say tonight. But as I sat in front of my computer, my intentions faded. In fact, I didn't really decide until a couple of days ago what I'd talk to you about tonight, so let me charge ahead and see if I can share something worthwhile. I should probably begin by talking about artists and government, but I don't really think I have anything new to tell you. No one born in the latter half of the 20th century can be unaware of the artist's role in a dictatorship. Hitler's Germany and Communist Russia both demonstrated that leaders expect artists to advance the interests of the regime. The German exhibition of Entartete Kunst, or degenerate art, which was held in March of 1937, is representative of the treatment disloyal artists can expect. Not even supporting Lenin and Stalin could save the Russian constructivists. Soviet realism did a better job of advancing the revolutionary themes and officially encouraged it supplanted constructivism in communist Russia. 150 years ago, Jacques-Louis David cemented his place in history and rallied the French with his painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Go back further and notice the images of Caesar on Roman coins. Then even further, and note the Babylonian stelae which warned enemies not to pass. The message seems clear. Artists should support the authoritarian state or be prepared to pay the price. The price can often be death, which is pretty discouraging. So are there definite occasions when artists should resist? Well, of course. Can I define them for you? Alas, no. What about artists in a democracy? Do they have easier choices? Well, probably, because most democracies avoid including genocide in their state objectives. The choices you face in the future may be less stark, but you'll still have to make choices about how to pursue your profession and, in fact, how to live your life. This is the disadvantage of writing it all out instead of having one page of notes. I could continue with the government and artist theme, but I don't know that I can tell you anything new. Yes, governments can be patrons of the arts with their 1% for art programs that require 1% of a building's construction cost to be spent on art. In some countries, not here alas, artists are revered people and often run for office or are appointed to important government commissions. But the real crunch time for artists comes when leaders seek to repress artists and their message. Historically, things go badly for the artists. I think you probably know that, so I don't think I can tell you any more in that regard. So I figure I'm done with that topic, right? Time to move on to something you might not be so familiar with. And I do have a couple thoughts on some things that you may not have been taught or learned yet. Most of us enjoy a good quote now and then. And one of the people we Americans like to quote is Mark Twain. Now, nowadays his name often comes up in conversations about how un-PC his characters are and how his work should be banned from school libraries. But I'm going to step gently around that controversy and focus on one of his simple observations. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. That's only 7 words, but the insight in that is profound. Here are 2 contemporary examples. Revolutions. 1776, the American Revolution. The first revolution that resulted in a democracy that acknowledged the value of individual lifestyles. Not including women, Native Americans, black people, and poor whites, but we're working on that, and we seem to be getting a little better. That was followed 13 years later by the French Revolution, the second revolution that resulted in a democratic republic, although it had to pass through regicide and Napoleon to get there. Communications between and within countries in the 18th century was a lot slower than it is today. Although life in France had been miserable for years, the knowledge that the revolution could be successful prepared the French. By 1789, 2 years of unrelenting rain had ruined harvests in France, providing the spark for revolution. Having had enough of the king, and knowing that the Americans did it, the French charged the Bastille. As an aside, I guess I'd note that these historical circumstances provide some insight into what may be coming with global warming. Once the crops die, there'll be a problem. Well, okay, that's enough of the 18th century. Let's go to last month. Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan. In the past couple of weeks, citizens of all 3 countries have marched to protest the lack of jobs and the hopelessness of living a meaningful life in those countries. In Tunisia, the marchers overthrew the government and danced in joy. When the word of Tunisia's success reached Egypt, Egypt and Jordan reached throughout the Middle East, Egypt and Jordan erupted. Now, Jordan seems to have calmed down in the last few days, but the Egyptians are continuing to protest. So what's the lesson here? Is it that unhappy people will revolt if they think it's possible to succeed? Yeah. We might also conclude that dictators are well advised to control communication within their countries if they wish to continue as dictators. But the real lesson here is about people. People in the 18th century embraced the same ideals that motivate people in our century. In fact, those ideals are pretty similar to the ideals that led Spartacus in his revolt against Rome. We tend to look back at history and think that it's too bad these people in the 18th century or ancient Rome, or even the Egyptians, didn't have the traits that allowed modern man to solve problems. It's true that thousands of years ago, people lacked the education and knowledge we have, but they weren't that different from us. They had the same motivations that Abraham Maslow described years ago in his hierarchy of human needs. That is, physical safety, self-worth, love, a fulfilling life. Those same factors motivate us today. If you place a human from 5,000 years ago in the same circumstances that a modern person finds themselves, they're both likely to act in the same way. People 5,000 years ago were shorter than we are, but they were people just like us. Another example. The U.S. has faced 3 major waves of immigration since our founding. Between 1850 and 1860, approximately 5 million immigrants came from Western Europe. From 1865 to 1890, another 10 million arrived, again, mostly from Western Europe. But in 1890 to 1914, 15 million people arrived. And they were from Turkey, Russia, Romanians, Jews, socialists. That's what we decided. Socialists, and we don't want them. Now, during this latter stage, when immigrants were arriving from undesirable countries, Congress worked hard to limit or forbid future immigration from those areas. Proper Bostonians were horrified that the Irish would destroy their civilized lives. Job advertisements warned that no Irish need apply. Politicians advised us that these people would take our jobs and bastardize our culture. Well, Americans certainly didn't want that to happen, so we all hopped on the anti-immigration bandwagon. Somehow the country survived. Compare this to today. It's the same. The differences are that it's the 21st century and the immigrants are primarily Latin. The technology that we use to follow immigration issues is different, more likely to be electronic than to be newsprint. But the people and their responses to the same issues is the same. And that's the nut of Twain's quote. People may use different technologies to achieve their goals, but if you place different people in similar circumstances, they're likely to react in the same manner, even if separated by centuries. I recently finished a powerful novel about the Vietnam War called Matterhorn. The protagonist of the book frequently finds himself in difficult circumstances and wonders why the hell he went to war. It's toward the end of the book that he considers this once more, while under heavy artillery fire and surrounded by the bodies of many of his troops. In a moment of insight, he realizes that he's at war for the same reason that Americans fought the Civil War and GIs fought World War II. In fact, for the same reason the Athenians fought the Spartans. We are all creatures of our geography, our time, and our socioeconomic status. We play out our roles in our time, just as the generations preceding us and have, and those that follow us will. We're all individuals, we're all the same. Or as Pete Townsend of The Who once noted, here's the new boss, same as the old boss. Maybe the real message I'm trying to transmit here is that if you want to know what's going on in the future, you should probably take a close look at the past. Now, why? At this point, since many of you are artists, you're probably wondering exactly why it is I chose to talk about history tonight. Well, let me explain it to you, Lucy. Even a survey course of Western civilization will provide enough information about the Congress of Vienna to impress you. Held over a 9-month period at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress provided a structure that established peace in Europe for the next century. The diplomats who attended that Congress and fashioned that peace were remarkable individuals. Each brought a lifetime of experience and expertise in diplomatic affairs. Contrast that with, I can see Russia from my house, the implication being that, well, I must be a wonderful diplomat. Or we could try this. Death boards. Obamacare will require your grandparents to appear before a bunch of bureaucrats who will decide if they should live and die and when. Excuse me? That doesn't seem very likely. Well, it's probably as likely as the fact that our president was born in Africa and doesn't have an American birth certificate and probably shouldn't be president. Last month, Brian Fisher, who is the chief executive of the American Family Association, warned us all that President Obama intends to give America back to the Indians. There was no riotous laughter after that, and there should have been. Glenn Beck has brought forth the idea that there's an incredible conspiracy to establish an Arab empire in the Middle East. How widespread is this conspiracy? Well, President Obama, first President Bush, and second President Bush all issued orders. You will not bomb ancient Babylonia. That might excite some of us who think maybe there's more findings there that we should be aware of. But no, the reason is that'll be the capital of this new Arab caliphate. That's crazy. Just crazy. And yet, people hesitate. Well, it could be true. Pigs could fly, perhaps. That could be true as well. Looking back, you get a sense of what the possible is and what people do. In times like ours, when outrageous statements are made and apparently accepted, you ought to pick up a book on history. Might give you some perspective and keep you in touch with reality. And those are the thoughts I brought tonight. if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Oh, thank you, Will.
You recommend any books?
Two that I've read recently that have really struck me. One is Matterhorn, which is a novel, and I don't know that I don't know how to recommend it. It's an ugly book. It was an ugly war. And also Bill Moyers on Democracy. It's a collection of speeches and essays that Moyers wrote or made. And his idea of how a nation should work and what it should strive for really parallels mine. So I love the book.
Do you find that, I mean, not that a revolution is an isolated incident, but do you find that beyond just periodic happenings, that there's actually a pattern that's consistent throughout history leading up to the rhymes?
Yes, I think so. I talked about the American and the French revolutions. In 1848, there were revolutions all across Europe. And I think they occur in flurries. Like people in a number of places are in similar positions, and they find out somewhere in country A they've done something to make it better. Well, we ought to try that too. So, yeah, I think they kind of run in flurries.
Well, in the 60s, the whole world was kind of on fire. America, rioting in the streets, Paris, Europe, Prague, people were fighting. And once I mean, just thinking about it just from right now without thinking about it in the big picture, it's like, not that much really seemed to happen out of that one. Like a lot of fury and all that, but it's like all the institutions kept their control and power out of it.
Well, they did, and yet it was curious that it again happened all over at roughly the same time.
68, it's exploded, yeah.
So we're curious creatures.
Well, one of the things that I think was said in the lead-in was about schooling. Do you really think that like there's a dumbing down of the universities? I mean, I don't see any action out of the universities when there should be right now, as far as the wars and all that. Where in the 60s it was, you know, all this stuff, all the riots always seem to come from the youth. You know, people don't have as much to lose, they're not part of the system yet, they're waking up going, this sucks.
The people who are going to be drafted.
Well, that's why they never had the draft.
I was going to say that if the draft was enacted,
Well, that's why
every
we would never do
university
it.
would be the same.
Yep.
Right.
But
That's
they're
why you use
playing it
National
safe,
Guard.
no draft, and nobody's
Yeah.
going to flip out.
When our National Guard are being used in ways they're never supposed to be used. They're supposed to be protecting our states, not going out and fighting international wars. That's just disgusting what has happened. And as a country, we're just silent over it.
Yeah, what's your views on why we're not having these same things happen in our society right now when there's definitely a call for change? I feel like it has some connection with economics, that the economics are so bad, everybody's just worried about their future and getting by, and not about the world in general. It's just this kind of struggle.
I've also not make my life harder.
Yeah.
Just get along, just get along.
You want to watch this, who wins American Idol? I'm most curious.
Should the astronaut fly, or should he stay by the Congresswoman's bedside? Why do
That's
we?
his business. as far as I'm
Exactly.
concerned.
Why are we?
That's between him and her. That's how I felt about the whole Clinton thing, which pissed me off. And I didn't care if he was Republican or Democrat, but impeaching him for stuff like that, it's like, you know what? This is a personal issue. The way they even got the information was against the law. Like, this is just stupid and retarded, and the people will just buy into it. Like, come on, please.
I appreciate your attitude, and did I see you in Portlandia?
I must be a character.
Do you, there's obviously a lot of parallels now between the Gilded Age as far as the separation between the poor and the rich, but again, it seems to be a situation where people don't recognize how vast the difference is between the poor and the rich, and not only in this country where our poorest live relatively well compared to third world countries and the rest of the world, but it seems like during the period of the Gilded Age, there were a lot more public uprisings. What do you think is different now? I mean, is it the same thing that we're talking about, the kind of entertainment aspect?
I think over the last couple decades, we've been fed a story of America as a free market country. Free market is what made us, what keeps us special. And in the free market, you kind of know your place. Economics helps show you if you have any doubt. I think you raise a good point. I think the income gap in the U.S. is now as great as it's ever been. If you read any of the stuff about the Egyptian revolutions, a lot of people were saying, look, there are a handful of people here that are rich, and the rest of us are struggling to eat. It is that difference that leads to calls for change, and if they're ignored, then it leads to revolution.
I mean, that's one of the biggest reasons for the propaganda campaign over the past, 20, 30 years, because they just changed the argument. It's never about, like, are you better off today than you were yesterday? You know, it's that, well, blame that guy. No, it's the system right now. The system's, like, just moving on without us. As, you know, it just makes us poorer and keeps people getting richer. There's just that fat greed up above, and it's institutionalized. I mean, part of the reasons for the recent meltdown was the fact that we didn't have any regulation, because regulation's all been cast aside over the the Bush years. Really, just it was the anti-FDR stuff, the anti-New Deal. I mean, I was just seeing that happen. Then nobody got blamed for this. I mean, a few fat cats, but they're still in power. They haven't gone anywhere. Pisses me off.
And it's difficult regulating banks because groups in Congress want to defend them.
And they get away with it.
Yeah, apparently they have.
What do you? So one of your lead on this revolution is disparity in income. Do you have any other things that make you a little bit nervous when you see it? Like, are there any warning signs, other warning signs to you personally?
I don't know that. I'm not really an expert in revolution.
No, just your personal opinion, not necessarily. Like, when you look at, let's say, Egypt, was there something that struck your eye and said, you know what, this is...
No, I think overall, if there's anything that disturbs me, it's what appears almost to be an across-the-board attack on the Enlightenment. Some of the examples that I used earlier, I can see Russia, so I'm a diplomat. People shouldn't be accepting that. That's nuts. And yet we want to put some kind of faith somewhere, because as we think about our problems, they seem remarkably difficult and almost impossible to solve. So in one sense, it's the attacks on rationality that we've seen. And it used to be there was rationality versus faith, and faith meant religion, and we kind of have worked all through that for a few centuries and still are. I don't think faith means that anymore. It seems like it means, I'll believe whatever you tell me, that means that I'm fine and I can blame other people. And it's also, I'm fine because, well, here's an example. People defend some of the bankers and some of the Wall Street hedge fund people that got us into problems. Why do they do that? Well, it's the American dream. If you restrict them, in 20 years when I'm up there, I'll get screwed by the restrictions, right? Maybe we haven't accepted that we ain't going to get up there.
That's the part that gets me too.
The system is the way it is.
That's what I was seeing in, about 15 years ago with knowing some serious Rush Limbaugh fans who were that, you talk with them about, how the system is skewed toward wealthy people and corporations and buying laws in Congress and such. So one fellow I talked to was like, well, quid pro quo, it's great, well, people get to do this kind of thing, and he basically he thought he was really enjoying being smug about being able to say quid pro quo, and and when I listened to some of his other talk about this stuff, I realized that the most valuable, the most precious thing to him was he had a pretty crappy life. He was supporting a wife and I'm not sure how many kids on making money as a contractor at Microsoft. And so that was his one chance to feel absolutely glorious, was to pretend that he had something in common with a billionaire. He got to pretend, and that was all of it. And so he got to pretend that billionaires' concerns were really his concerns, and so that he would like ride along with them. I was curious though. So we've had basically.
Of course you are. That's why you're here.
Yeah, we've had like
For a group.
Yeah, sorry to follow on with the question, but we've had pundits going back. I don't know how long. I mean, a lot of these guys we hear, Bill O'Reilly and some of these other wackos, they sound a lot like Father Coughlin back in the day. But do you see a difference, and do you see maybe a difference in the level of ignorance that's accepted? Or, because, I mean, I think Americans have always gone for a fair amount of anti-intellectualism and even proud ignorance. I'm a proud American, but...
Well, I feel like if anything that's based out of, it's based out of fear. Like if you can accept what somebody tells you, then you don't have to worry, and when you're constantly being inundated with all of this information, which is really propaganda, you don't really have time to process it for yourself. Mm-hmm. And I think with, where we're at with like technology and media, it's so constant. It's everywhere you go. It's on billboards, we're all online, it's in the commercials, it's on the so-called news programs. You're always hearing something, and so when do you have that time to step back and get in touch with yourself? And I think that's a big issue. I don't know, I was going to ask your opinion on like the advancements in technology with our seeming social complacency. Like, we're just sitting here, the face.
Yeah.
To the face. But I just feel like we spend so much time like, online and Facebooking and doing all these things that are sort of separating ourselves from ourselves. Mm-hmm. Like we're constantly, like third person, what's my status gonna be? Like what am I gonna say as opposed to what am I gonna feel, or what am I going to decide to do, like just as myself in this society, because we're not looking around and interacting anymore.
I recall getting on the elevator at the Art Institute once and riding up with two people who were texting and one person who actually had her computer. And she was emailing, I guess. And none of us talked to each other. Probably didn't have much to share. So I can't answer your technology question because I'm one of those way behind the curve boomers. And I'm pretty intimidated by technology, but I'm also pretty amazed at the changes I've seen in the last decade, and have the sense that we're kind of at the front end of this, and I have no idea what's going to happen.
I guess, how do you feel, like, from an outside view, not being technologically in sync or going along with it? How do you feel that?
I think you're
people
nuts
change
putting any
socially?
information about yourself up online. That's it. I don't trust people out there. I have no idea what they can use with any, or do with any information that they have about me. But I worry about it.
So there's an argument made that the speed at which technology doubles is an exponential.
Curve.
Yes, an exponential.
Like
curve.
the culture.
Yeah, and so there's as we move forward in time, the rate of technology doubling just increases. Do you think that in tandem with that, as new technology arrives, it might at first empower and then sort of become controlled, and as a result maybe that all is pretty broad and maybe a stretch, but that, like, these sort of increases in technologies, they've happened over history and are continue to happen and move on to the future. Do you think there's any correlation between that and cultural revolution? And
I think technology drives us. We invented the automobile, and we have changed the face of the country in the last century for the automobile. Cars now announce that you can just plug in, and they have got a special plug so you can plug in and run your computer. Other than thinking that technology drives us, I don't know where this one is going. I know, for example, in Egypt, when the internet was cut off, people rummaged around their drawers and found their dial-up modems and called France to get their stories out. So there's always going to be this, we can control the technology. No, you can't.
so as the technology develops and accelerates in speed, do you think culture itself, the transitions in culture and cycles in culture, are also accelerating? Does that seem?
Maybe we should tie that back to your question of when do we find the time to reflect on things when we're all involved with the technology. That may be the case.
I think it's kind of interesting because Iran and Egypt both kind of, their little mini revolutions have started with Facebook. And like for us, I don't know, maybe we're too mature and like we're riding this wave and we're kind of self-obsessed. We don't have huge issues. We have enough to be pissed off about it if we choose to, but we don't, as a country, really choose it. But you know, like nothing compared to Egypt and Iran. It's like, you know, the oppression. You know, they started their revolution. I don't want to call them little, through social media.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of amazing for us to think, you know, but you know, we can do things by groups. We just don't seem to choose to. But they're proving that it is possible. But once they're unplugged, it's like, yeah, but the fire already started. So, you know, hopefully it's a prairie fire and there's nothing you can do about it. But
although we have seen, and particularly in Iran, that the old-fashioned club can trump technology.
well, yeah, I mean that's what Egypt's not doing. If the army was involved, things would probably be over. It doesn't make for a happy people, but it's an oppressed people. But the army has thankfully stayed, that I know of, out of it so far, and has kind of stayed on the sidelines. Hell, they even let some people just beat the crap out of each other. It's like, it's not our affair. It's between you guys. Like, okay, that's interesting. I don't know quite what to think about all that, but at least they're not in there, because usually the army would bust heads for whoever's in power.
Mm-hmm.
Because wherever the army goes, so goes power.
True. Although when you think about how much aid we give to Egypt and how much of that is military aid,
Right.
you can understand the
just made their
generals are
army
interested
better.
in what we think.
Yeah.
In fact, generally that seems an observation. In the past we've had, we aren't going to talk to Cuba, they're commies. In fact, you're more influential around people that you help.
Yeah, that argument I know has come up with Cuba too, especially because they just wouldn't, as a nation, just don't want to deal with Castro screwing.
Plus
You know?
your opportunity to learn something from another is greatly increased if that other is very different from you rather than exactly like you.
Indeed.
We got from relationships.
Yeah.
How do you think that technology has influenced the artist as far as from a revolutionary standpoint or counterculture standpoint? I'll just put it that way instead.
Here with our internet, it's I don't know whether it encourages it, but it sure makes it possible.
Do you think it makes it less effective because there's so much of it, dilutes it or something? I don't know what to think myself.
It probably depends on whether you have an artist that is thoughtful, because we all face that incredible amounts of information and got to sort through to figure out what you think is true.
Agreed. I think it almost dilutes it because it's like over time with younger children, they've shown that the attention span, because of the effect of the internet, is growing so small that a lot of times if teenagers or younger people who just live their lives on the internet in a way, in school and outside of school, that they'll be interested or look at an article, but they'll only scan through it. They don't actually read the whole thing or read a book on it. They just scan like the first 2 paragraphs and wonder, oh, well, is that interesting enough? And their interest is lost after that. So they don't actually go through the whole article and read.
Maybe we're leaning toward circumstances that you're describing the internet almost as a drug.
It is.
Maybe
yeah.
we should have the FDA regulation.
Well, so when does revolution come if we're all sort of absorbed into these little machines? Like,
Brave New World.
no, it's so, I know, but it's sort of becoming more and more true. And so like I wonder, like we talk about the cyclical nature of history and these events, but like when does ours come, when it seems like we're just doing more and more sitting and staring at these bright boxes?
I think it's gonna have to crash and burn. That's what I think. That's me personally, not you, sorry.
Go on.
All
I'm just
opinions are
throwing it-
welcome.
Well, because, I mean, really, as a nation, we were finally pissed off for a moment when everything crashed with the economy. You know, they did, for once I actually, from what I know about what little I know about the inner workings of the Treasury and all that, they kind of did what they had to, because things were about to collapse. And all of those institutions were completely interconnected. If one goes, they all go. Well, somebody if somebody was paying attention to that, they just vilified her and fired her and got rid of her during the Clinton administration. Because somebody did say, hello, we have a problem here. I forgot her name, but
It makes it seem like they wanted it to happen.
well, it's just natural greed. I mean, it's I don't even know it's how much, I mean, I think it's just inevitable. Greed will always consume itself. That's just the nature of greed. And if some greed happens, more greed will happen. And then everybody gets on the bandwagon and then more greed happens. It's exponential. But for us, I mean, as a populace for America, we're gonna have to get pissed off. And until something really bad happens, it still is like, whoa, yeah, how many people responded to that last post I had? Well, you know, we're distracted.
But on the on the technology front, I think there are in some way small revolutions that are happening. They're sort of less visible because they're not that well reported. But there's groups that, like, in response to Julian Assange, his problems have attacked, like hackers that have attacked the companies that have withdrawn funding from WikiLeaks.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
the group,
Right.
the anonymous group, and then they just did. Oh God, I read about it and now I've totally spaced out exactly what they did. But they did something just the other day where they attacked. Well, I'd have to look it up, but.
You know,
But yeah, but in any
support
case,
things.
it's like sort of global. They're global online actions against anything that they like. Their main issue seems to be like any sort of like internet regulation anytime that there's internet regulation, then that's their main thing. But yeah.
You saying somebody's vigilant out there?
Yeah. So, well, there's a large groups of people, and some were just recently arrested in result of Julian Assange and taking away funding. We should probably wrap up. So.
Go ahead. Okay, Philip Bell, why do you sit with your back to the wall?
That was another possible topic. As I spent 20 years as a government lobbyist, and remember, was it Hickok that?
Aces and eights.
Yeah.
Malcolm X
Sit against
here.
the wall, watch who's coming. Don't trust. I don't know if that was an adequate answer.
That's
If I
fine.
expanded it, I would embarrass people.
Thanks everyone for attending. The next meeting commences on February 8th
Oh,
at
no,
6
sorry,
p.m.
it's the 22nd.
On the 22nd at 6 p.m. with our speaker Aaron Lacoma of Acanthus Upholstery. Aaron Lacoma's talk will give an overview about the upholstery trade, its history and origins, and how she got started and eventually trained as a professional upholsterer. Aaron will bring one of our pieces to demonstrate basic upholstery techniques and talk about the evolution from her first shop, Sit On It, which was a conventional upholstery shop using petroleum-based foams, polyester battings, and fabrics of unknown origins, to the current shop, Acanthus, which uses natural latex, organic battings, and most of the fabrics are milled in the U.S. and free of toxic treatments.
Isn't
Thanks
she a
for coming.
famous sister?
She also is my sister. Yes.
Disclaimer.